Welcome to Understanding Perspectives. On today's installment, I'm going to be talking about the reasons why people have different views about divine foreknowledge. In the last episode, I talked about 5 different ways of thinking about divine foreknowledge and kind of what the differences were, but I didn't get into why that people hold to these different views. So today, that's what I'm going to try and talk about. And I'm going to get to some of the scriptures a little bit later, but to start with, I'd like to talk about what I think are the main reasons why at least most people hold a particular view. And this was the case with me. And so I'm going to use myself as an example. I grew up in a Christian home, and I was surrounded by people who were of good character, both in my immediate family and my extended family. And I knew that some of these people had studied the scriptures kind of a lot, and that they were serious about conforming their lives to the truth. And so even before I could have articulated all that, I think I intuitively trusted them and accepted their perspectives as my own without skepticism. So I think that even people who grow up in bad environments, that when they do encounter someone that they trust, who that they recognize has studied the scriptures and that have reasons that they can articulate why that they believe what they believe, or at least that they can articulate what they believe in a clear way, that a lot of people end up inheriting their beliefs or ways of thinking from others, that from their teachers and preachers and things like that, and people in their family. So I think that that's probably the biggest reason that people hold on, have a particular view about this subject, is that they inherited it. And that's not to say that's necessarily a bad thing, but it's not necessarily a good reason for holding to a particular view. In my case, I definitely changed my mind about what I think about this subject. And some of the people who are in my family agree with me about this, and some of them don't. And this was not something that I received direct teaching from people in my family about, but I did receive some direct teaching from other people at churches and at school. And my trust in them led me to accept their view as my own. And so I think this is one of the reasons why that James talks about in chapter 3, verse 1, I think it is, that not many of you should become teachers, because teachers will be judged more strictly than others. I'm paraphrasing there, but because teachers influence the lives of lots of other people, or at least potentially do, in ways that can be both beneficial or harmful, they have a stricter judgment that they're going to face. And so it's one of the reasons that I've taken this approach in sharing about these subjects, is that, I could be wrong about any number of things. I know too well that I feel like that I have been wrong about lots of things in the past, or at least I've changed my mind about a lot of different things. And so I don't want to get up here and say, okay, this is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, because, I might change my mind next week about some of this kind of stuff. A lot of it I have studied at some length, and I think I understand what the issues are, but I don't want to be dogmatic and have somebody rely on me and put their trust in me, and therefore be led down a wrong path. So I'm trying to take the approach of sharing the range of things about what I know, and why that different people think like they think, so that I can objectively report to you what the evidence is, so that you can consider the evidence for yourself and look at the different ways that people have understood the data and come up with a conclusion that is hopefully right. And so the reason I mentioned this um, is that I want to encourage each person that's listening to this to humble themselves to the point where they can have an open mind to consider the possibility that you might be wrong about something. And not only to consider that you might be wrong about something, but to consider the possibility that maybe the very person that you've inherited your beliefs from, they might have also inherited their beliefs and accepted them uncritically. And one of the things that I have noticed is that people, when they're teaching, very rarely do what I'm trying to do right here. They they'll share what their own view is, and I don't presume to know the reasons why that they don't share what the other alternatives are and why that they don't hold to these other views. I don't know what the reasons that people have for doing that is, but I suspect that sometimes it's the case that people just don't know enough about the other views to represent them effectively or even incorrectly, and that they just know what their own view is, and so they share their own view. And I guess that's okay, but um, I don't want to take that approach because it seems like a dangerous position to take in terms of my own judgment that I will face. Uh, I want to come out as good as possible when I'm judged, and so I want to present the evidence as fairly as I can so that I don't mislead anybody and possibly cause someone to reject God or uh, fall into rebellion or whatever because they develop a wrong view of Him as a result of what I would want to teach. And so I want to be careful to not take a dogmatic approach about anything, and instead to give a just more of an informative sort of here's ways that people think about this, and consider for yourself what you should think. So um, I think that's probably I think the fact that people inherit their views from others is probably the most common reason that people have differences about this subject of divine foreknowledge, and for most other subjects as well. But for this one, I think that's almost certainly the case because, uh, from what I can tell, a lot of people just don't know about what the other options really are and what the scriptures are that people who have really looked into this have cited as support for their own view. Um, so I think that's the main reason that people have whatever view they have. But there also may be uh, a good number of people who have the view that they do because it's what they like. And so they want to think that God is good, and so they ignore views that would impugn His character and just rule those out as possibilities right from the start because they have a trust in the goodness of God's character. And so there's probably some of that too. And on the other side of things, it may be that some people have a view of God's power and sovereignty that would lead them to take a more determinist view of divine foreknowledge. And their preconception about what God is like leads them to take that view. And however, these first two reasons, what other people have, what people have been, the beliefs that people have inherited from others, and the preferences that people have, these, I think, sometimes form a lens, if you will, of understanding. So that, and this definitely was the case with me when I was growing up, that, and even after I was an adult for a long time, because I thought I knew the answer to some of these questions and other stuff that I haven't even discussed on YouTube yet, but I thought I knew what was right. And so because I trusted in the opinions of the people that I had been taught by. And so when I went to the scriptures myself and would read, if I found something that didn't seem to fit what I thought I already knew and what I believed to be true, then I didn't question what I already thought I knew was right. Instead, I questioned my own ability to understand what I was reading. And I thought it must not mean what it sounds like it says because I already know what's right. And so, therefore, I just must not have this figured out yet. And so, while I think that was a humble approach to take, I think it's can be a dangerous one if you always default to that. I think that we should keep an open mind to the possibility that we could be wrong and that the people that we have been taught by might be wrong. Not to say that we should be skeptical to the point of rejecting everything, um, but I think we should be open minded enough to be correctable. Okay, so I'll stop talking about that and move on to what the reasons are that people of these 5 different perspectives that I laid out in the last episode hold to their view. So just as a recap, we had divine determinism, middle foreknowledge, simple foreknowledge, open theism, and process theology. And so I'm going to loop process theology and open theism together in this session because all the things that are going to apply to one in the scriptures will apply to the other that I'm aware of. And if there are scriptures that the process theology guys and the open theists would hold a different perspective on, I'm not really aware of that because I think that as it pertains to this subject of divine foreknowledge that they both want to say that the future is open. The open theists might say, well, it's open in fewer respects than the process theology guys think, but they both want to say it's open in many respects. And so the same set of verses will apply to both of their perspectives most of the time. All right, but I'm going to start at the other end of the spectrum with scriptures and talk about divine determinism. There's a lot of passages that you could cite for each of these views, but they all have kind of a common theme for each different view. And so start with Ephesians 1:11 for divine determinism. It says, "In him we have obtained an inheritance, having been predestined according to the purpose of him who works all things according to the purpose of his will." Okay, so the divine determinist will read a scripture like this, and they will see it as a controlling passage, one that will inform them about how that they should interpret other scriptures. And this is an important thing to talk about, and you'll often hear divine determinists talk about this particular subject. They will make a distinction between didactic texts and narrative or historical texts. And a didactic text is one where there's a direct teaching about how something works, right? Or something we should believe about God, and it's like, okay, here's something you need to believe about God, believe this. And there are other texts, narrative text or historical text, that just are part of the story. And so there'll be details in some of these texts that would appear to contradict the divine determinist sort of view. And so what they say is that, okay, you got to stay with the didactic text because we can trust those because they're specifically trying to teach us something. That's their stated purpose, is that they're trying to teach something. Whereas some of the things in a historical narrative are not true. You know, not that they didn't happen, but there would be, for example, let's talk about just briefly the 3 friends of Job in the book of Job. Well, God reamed them out around chapter 43 or something like that about how that the things that they were saying were not right. Okay, so if you go back and you read throughout the earlier books, other chapters of the book, then you'll find statements that these guys were saying as part of this story that are inaccurate. But they're inaccurate in their representation of what God is like and how the universe works, but they're accurate in terms of representing what the view of these people were. So they say, well, you can't trust just these statements in the historical narrative to be uh, reliable in terms of telling you what you should think about God because of the kind of context that they're found in. So you got to go to the didactic text and decide, okay, these are the things that we're going to have control the way that we understand other scriptures. And so there's a handful of really broad texts like this one in Ephesians 1:11 and say Isaiah 46:10, passages like this that make it sound like that God, they do surface. I could definitely see why people would read these and think that just means that God controls everything. While it doesn't explicitly state it in so many words, that's what a lot of people think that these passages are saying. And so they consider these to be the didactic texts that are teaching us what we're supposed to think, and that those therefore become the controlling ones that guide them in interpreting other passages. Other people don't necessarily disagree with this, but they don't always agree about what the didactic texts are, and they don't agree necessarily about the context of each historical narrative, where there would be something that indicates a feature of God or in the way that he thinks, or something about the narrative that indicates something about the nature of reality or how God chooses people and things like that. So, for example, the open theists and the process theology guys, they would want to cite Jeremiah 18. And I'm going to read verses 7 and 8 right here. It says, "If at any time I declare concerning a nation or a kingdom that I will pluck up and break down and destroy it, and if that nation concerning which I have spoken turns from its evil, I will relent of the disaster I intended to do to it." Okay, so the open theist and the process theology guys, they're going to say, well, this is a didactic text too. And this is actually God speaking to Jeremiah about the way that he's going to deal not only with Israel, but about any nation or kingdom. And that this is they'll say that he says, if at any time he declares this, and they turn from their evil, that he will relent from the disaster that he really did intend to do to it. And so they'll say, look, God said he really did intend to bring disaster, and he really did change his mind and not do it when they turn from their evil. Or at least he's saying that when they do this, I will turn from the disaster I intended to bring, even though I really did intend to bring it. And so they think that this represents the idea that God really does change his mind sometimes, and that he's always open to doing that if people will repent. Similarly, the next couple verses say the opposite thing. If God's declared a blessing on a nation and they reject him, then he'll repent of or not bring the blessing he intended, and instead he'll bring judgment. And so so the open theists and the process theology guys say, look, this is a didactic text too. We can't just ignore this in favor of a particular understanding of passages like Ephesians 1:11 and Isaiah 46:10. Okay, let me move on from this for a second. I'm going to give you a passage that the simple foreknowledge people will quote. This is 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. It says, "Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who are elect exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, according to the foreknowledge of God the Father, in the sanctification of the Spirit, for obedience to Jesus Christ, and for sprinkling with his blood, may grace and peace be multiplied to you." So, in this verse, 2 verses, it talks about that Peter was writing to these elect exiles, right? So this, the elect is the key verse, the key word here that we need to think about. And this is talking about how that God chooses the people who are the elect, right? So it says there, he's writing to these elect who are elect according to the foreknowledge of God the Father. Okay, so the simple foreknowledge group just wants to say, look, it's pretty plain. This is also a didactic text, and it says, and they think that it says that God's foreknowledge is the basis on which that He elected to choose these particular ones to be saved. And so they, as opposed to the divine determinists, they want to say, the divine determinists say God decided who He's going to pick, and so therefore His foreknowledge is based on His decision in the eternal past. The simple foreknowledge group wants to say God looked down the corridors of time somehow, and because, or maybe just because it's an essential feature of His nature that He just has to know all things is definite, then He knows somehow that we can't explain how that people are freely going to choose to accept Him, and on the basis of that knowledge, He then retroactively chooses them. Okay, so that's kind of what they would say, and maybe someone would dispute part of that, but that's the kind of idea, and this is the sort of verse that they would cite for that. And this is, I think, the strongest one for that particular view. All right, now we're going to talk just briefly about the middle foreknowledge group. And this is, they base their theory about how that God's sovereignty and His election and His foreknowledge all fit together into, they consider this counterfactuals to be a really important piece of their view. And a counterfactual is something that is not true, but that would have been true in a different circumstance. So if you listen to the prior episode, then you can learn about what the differences are and exactly what that means about how God chose from all these possible worlds. But I won't get into that in this episode. I don't want to make it too long. But they see that these other worlds that God could have created, that they think that there are true facts about what those worlds would have been like in other cases. And so they cite scriptures like Matthew 11:23 to support that idea. And it says, "And you, Capernaum, will you be exalted to heaven? You'll be brought down to Hades. For if the mighty works done in you have been done in Sodom, it would have remained until this day." So they see this as an affirmation that in a different world, if the mighty works that Jesus did in Capernaum had been done in Sodom, that Sodom would have repented and that God wouldn't have destroyed them. And so they think that this is affirming the truth of, or the truth, affirming the truth of counterfactuals and the truth value of counterfactuals. That's what I was trying to find. The truth value of counterfactuals, and they would extend that to all counterfactuals have a known truth value. And so that's that set of facts and those set of truths about these alternate worlds that God could have created are what gives God the sovereign ability to choose between these various worlds that He could have created to create the one in which that we actually are living, that He did actualize, and therefore produce His foreknowledge of what will definitely be in this world because He chose to create this particular world. And those facts were just facts about it. So how do we decide which way of looking at the scriptures is valid? If all these are, now maybe the one here in Matthew, it may not be one that would necessarily be considered a didactic text, but maybe they might assert that it is. If all these are didactic texts and they're all teaching different things, or apparently different things, how do we sort it out? And so that's the challenge. And I think it can be done. I don't really want to tell you what my perspective is because I don't want to put a slant on this that would influence you in the wrong direction. Not that I think that I'm wrong about this, but I want to present the facts as objectively as I can. And so I just want to share the facts with you, and I'll offer uh, the explanations that other people give as I understand them. So the divine determinists would look at verses like Ephesians 1, Isaiah 46, and they would conclude that these are the controlling didactic texts, and they think that they express clearly that God can control all things, and that he wants to, and that he does. And so whenever you go to passages like Jeremiah 18, for example, that says, if at any time I declare concerning a nation or a kingdom that I'll pluck up and break down and destroy it, and if that nation concerning which I have spoken turns from its evil, I will relent of the disaster that I intended to do to it. So if the divine determinist reads Jeremiah 18, they'll say, well, it's not a didactic text, even though it's coming from the mouth of God, and even though it's talking about these universal circumstances, like if at any time he makes this such a declaration, they'll say it's not really a didactic text, and that instead they may say that it's an anthropomorphism. And an anthropomorphism is a strange word that is basically, the idea is that it's giving human attributes to God, or it could even be used about other things like animals and things like that. But in this context, they would use it to say that Jeremiah was, or that God, and I guess in this case, since Jeremiah is just reporting what God said, that God was stooping to our level, that in a way that we could understand, and talking as if he really was changing his mind, because of course from the divine determinist perspective, God doesn't change his mind. It's impossible for him to change his mind because he never changes. In fact, not even in his experience. So from one moment to the next, God's experience of reality is unchanging because he is immutable in the strongest sense, that he doesn't change at all, not even in his experience of the passage of time. He doesn't have emotions that vary, things like that. So that's the divine determinist almost always embrace that sort of idea about God's nature and experience, that he's like, his experiences of every moment at once all the time, in this timeless eternity. Maybe a lot of them, maybe most divine determinists think that God lives in timeless eternity. And so when they see this interaction between God and people in time, then they say, well, that's God's just saying that as if it's from our perspective. But of course we know that God's perspective is what's really accurate, and this is not God's perspective. That's what they would say, that this is projecting human attributes onto God. And then all the other passages that would, say something similar about God changing his mind, or being surprised, or having regrets, things like that, which there are lots of passages of that kind, then they would say the same thing, that those are no different than saying that God has feathers, because it talks about how he wants to gather his people under himself, like a chick gathers her hens, or like a hen gathers her chicks. And so, nobody really thinks that God is a bird, and that he has feathers and he's gathering people up underneath him. But it's some imagery that is used to express something true about God, that he's kind of like a mother hen, and that he wants to protect his chicks, right, his children. But they don't take it literally that he has feathers. And so they would say, okay, in a similar way, we can look at these passages and say, God doesn't really have this sort of experience, even though it sounds like it from the scriptures that he does, because they would say these are not the didactic texts. These are the historical narrative text, even though it's God speaking. And so they have this peculiar way of dealing with these passages. Now, it's actually the middle foreknowledge and the simple foreknowledge group actually have to have kind of this same approach with regard to all these passages that talk about God changing his mind and anticipating possibilities and talking about, if and maybe and stuff like that about the future even from God's perspective, and testing people to know what they will do. They have to also say this because both the simple foreknowledge and the middle foreknowledge group views the future as exhaustively settled in every respect. And so if it's exhaustively settled, then these passages about, God changing his mind and having a willingness to do something different, they don't actually represent anything true about the world, because if they're right and the future is settled in every respect, then there is no such thing as a future possibility, and these alternatives that are apparently referred to in the text are just not part of reality. And so they have this similar problem. On the other end of the spectrum with the process theology guys and the open theists, they take a different slant on this, and they say, look, we're going to try to affirm everything that the text says explicitly and try not to infer things that aren't there. When they read passages like Ephesians 1:11 that says, in him we have obtained an inheritance, having been predestined according to the purpose of him who works all things according to the purpose of his will, they can say, yeah, God works all things according to his purpose. And he has predestined us who are in Christ to be conformed to the image of his Son. But this part about the purpose of him who works all things according to the purpose of his will, they would say something like, this verse doesn't tell us what God's purpose is. It doesn't tell us that it's God's purpose to control everything. And similarly, when they go to Isaiah 46 and they read that passage, which I don't have ready to quote for you, but they see that it only says that God can do whatever he wants to do, whatever he desires to do. But it doesn't tell us, explicitly at least, that it is God's desire to determine everything in advance. It doesn't explicitly say that, either there or anywhere else so far as they can see. And so they think that the idea that God is going to determine whatever he wants is right, that he will determine, he has purposes, and he will accomplish them whatever they are. But they do not assume that it is God's purpose to control everything. Whereas the divine determinist does think it's God's purpose to control everything. And whereas now in this respect, the simple foreknowledge would not be on the side of the divine determinists here, because they don't want to say that it was God's purpose to decide everything. They just want to say that they want to attribute a lot to the will of humans and angels and maybe even animals. But they still want to say that it's all settled in God's mind in advance and that he knows it all is definite. And they don't think it's settled on the basis of his determination, but they think it's settled on the basis of his essential attribute of omniscience, which they assume includes knowing all things that's definite. And so this is where they differ from the open theists and the process theology guys, is that the process theology and the open theists do not assume that it's part of God's essential nature that he knows all things is definite. Even though the majority of these people would say that God is omniscient, they affirm that God can be omniscient and know what all the possibilities are and accurately know what's real at the same time. So to say that if the possibilities in the future are real, and it's really real that people or angels or even animals or even lesser beings, bacteria and viruses and things like that, if whatever these entities have a level of autonomy that God has given to them, then if that is real and they can really resolve between real alternatives, then until it is the case that those have either been resolved in actuality or by the solidification of their character or other factors that we maybe haven't considered, until those facts are uh, actual facts of what will happen, as long as they are still possibilities, then God would know them as possibilities because He knows all reality accurately. So, and I used the example before that God doesn't know that there's a unicorn sitting in my lap right now, precisely because if He knew that, that would be a false belief. And God only has true beliefs, so He would not believe something that is false. So if it's false that there is a unicorn sitting in my lap, then He wouldn't believe that. He wouldn't know that that was true. Similarly, if the future is full of real possibilities that might or might not happen, God would not know that those things were certain, because that would also be false, that they would be certain if they're in fact still uncertain. And so this distinction is specific between God's essential nature and the reality. That's the disagreement among the open theist, the process theology, and the simple foreknowledge, and I guess also the middle foreknowledge. But so both the open theist and the process theology and the divine determinist, they will root their belief in God's sovereignty and whatever foreknowledge that He does have that's definite about the future, they will root that in God's power and His decision to do whatever's going to happen or bring about whatever events He's going to bring about. But they differ in that the extent to which that God has desires to determine everything, and to the extent to which that He has done that and will do that. The open theist and the process theology guys, they think that there's a whole set of didactic texts. They would say that all these that I've read, that they're all didactic texts and they're all teaching something that is true about God, but that the other groups have inferred things into the text that they consider to be controlling that are actually not there. And so they would affirm the truth of all these statements, just not in the same way that other people do, because they have a different understanding about what's actually being stated in these other passages. And because they take this view, they can also affirm the things that are in the texts that are historical or narrative type sections that fit into this open sort of future without having to resort to saying it's some kind of anthropomorphism where God is just putting things in a way that we can understand. And this is, I think, one of the weaknesses of the other views, especially the divine determinist view, is that they have to say that these are anthropomorphisms. Well, let me put it a different way. They're basically saying that they are smart enough to realize that these didactic texts that they cite are revealing what is really true about God in the way that they understand it, but that in all these historical narratives where God reveals Himself in a way that is actually not representing what is true about Him, that He does so because we're not smart enough to understand what He's really like. So they have a strange contradiction that is rarely pointed out. And let me repeat that in a little bit different way to make it a little bit more clear. So they're saying that they are smart enough to identify what's really true about God from the didactic text, but that God didn't think that the human race was intelligent enough to understand those things about Him from those same didactic texts. So He revealed Himself in a way that we could understand in the historical narrative that would say something very different than the didactic texts, because it's easier for us to understand that. So this is one of the main problems that I see with the divine determinism view, is that they insist on a particular understanding of the particular text that they consider to be didactic, and so they interpret other passages through that lens, that in a way that I find to be unsatisfying. So anyway, hopefully that makes sense. And if there's questions about this, post them in the comments below, and I'll try to read them and maybe make future videos in response to them. Maybe include questions of the different groups that I will, or different people I will be hopefully interviewing in the future, to see what they have to say about any of these things that are maybe a little bit less clear. But thank you for listening. I appreciate you taking the time. May God bless you. Subscribe, share this with a friend, and turn on the notifications so that you can be notified whenever we're producing more videos and audio in the future. God bless you.